that was the soundtrack to his telling me what had happened to his daughters,
Yeah.
that, aged 8 and 10, had again, like their mother, been sold, were presumably being daily raped. His sons had been taken away, recruited into a militia, brainwashed, so that if they saw him, they would kill him. I mean, this is he's just one of multitudes and multitudes of Yazidis who've suffered like that, and I think that they deserve to be, the focus of global attention much more than they are.
Hi everyone, I'm Petrus and welcome to WorldView. WorldView is a podcast where we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. If you're watching our content so far and liked it, please consider liking this video, subscribing and donating on Patreon. Today we're talking with Tom Holland. Tom is an English author who has published best-selling books like the book Dominion on a range of topics including classical, medieval history and the origins of Islam. In addition to his writing, he has worked with the BBC to create and host historical television documentaries and presents the radio series Making History. He also hosts a podcast called The Rest is History. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for having me.
So we have this situation where we kind of like when we research the people that come on the show, we watch some of the previous podcasts you've done, and we try and generate questions that we think probably you haven't heard or could be interesting, or something you could react to that'll be new and fascinating for you to have a good discussion about. And one of the podcasts I watched was a podcast you did about 2 years ago on a channel called Trigonometry, where you talked about your book Dominion. And in this you explained the concept, or you talked about the concept of Puritanism and its connection to history. Could you just, before we get into the discussion on that, could you just briefly describe please Puritanism and its connection to history?
Well, Puritanism is it's a specifically Protestant English phenomenon, and the idea of purity is something that is very fundamental to Christian history over the entire sweep. And I think the evidence for that is that Puritan in Greek would be a cathar, so someone who purifies himself, and the cathars is the name that is given to medieval heretics. But it's also a kind of heretic who existed way back in the very beginnings of Christian history. They get condemned at the Council of Nicaea, where the Nicene Creed gets drawn up. So the word Puritan is not one. It's one that's often applied by Orthodox mainstream Christians towards people who they feel perhaps are kind of proud, too proud of their sense of purity. So it's not one that the people who become called Puritans themselves actually welcome. But essentially, that is what they're about. They do see themselves as a kind of an elect. They see themselves as people who are called by God, who have been given peculiarly visited by the power of the Spirit. And I think perhaps the overwhelming characteristic of Puritans is this incredible sense of self-analysis. So to be a Puritan, to be assured that you have that you are one of the elect, requires you constantly to look into your soul, to self-analyze, to mark yourself against the kind of the ledger book of sins that you might be racking up, and so although it's often used in a kind of very pejorative sense today, people who are Puritans are seen as killjoys, wagging their finger, telling you not to have fun. Actually, I think they're incredibly morally serious people, and in their concern to do the right thing, kind of strangely admirable.
And you mentioned in that podcast also, it was really interesting to watch. You mentioned that you kind of had this very central theme of people cleansing themselves. It's like going through the cleansing history in a ritual in the original Christian dogma, where a lot of what they do, they needed to cleanse themselves and create themselves or vision themselves in this kind of Puritanism sense. And in that way, they actually embody something that you mentioned, absolutism. When did absolutism commence in Western history? Or Western society even?
What do you mean exactly by absolutism? Because absolutism, I mean, classically means absolute monarchy. So a drive to bring everything kind of under the monarch's control. And actually, it's a relatively, it's a recent phenomenon. It's essentially it's a 17th century phenomenon. So
really?
The classic model of absolutism in European history would be Louis XIV at Versailles. L'État
Oh.
c'est moi, the state it's me.
Hmm.
In Britain, the idea that kings rule with a divine right is associated with James I of England, who was previously James VI of Scotland. And in a sense, his son Charles I, it's his insistence on kind of absolute rule, the sense that he's been ordained by God to rule, and that essentially Parliament shouldn't be feeding into the equation, that leads to the civil wars and the convulsions. And certainly in Britain and in the Anglophone tradition, that is that's a tradition that gets powerfully rejected. And of course, the absolutist tradition in France gets rejected in 1789 with the French Revolution. So it's actually absolutism in that sense it's a pretty
it's very modern
17th and 18th century phenomenon.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting because I also thought that the concept of absolutism in the religious sense, where there was an absolute deity, an absolute way that you should follow things, was something that's created by the rules and regulations of the Roman Catholic Church. Or is that missing the point?
I don't think the word absolutism is. I mean, I haven't come across it applied quite in that sense. There is. Clearly, one of the things within Christianity is a tension between the idea that there are absolute moral standards that everyone has to live by, and the rejection that goes all the way back to Paul of the idea that this is vested in a set framework of laws of the kind that that God had given to Moses, and Moses in turn had given to the children of Israel, and which passed down to the Jews, then gets elaborated over the course of Jewish history. After the time of Christ into the late antique period, the Talmudic, the rabbis elaborated the Talmud, this entire vast corpus of law. In the Christian tradition, you don't have that, because Paul, in proclaiming the second covenant, the first covenant being the
Moses,
this second covenant is, he says, is written on the heart, and so therefore to know what the what God's law is, you have to look into your own heart, and essentially this becomes the concept of conscience, and of course. One of the corollaries of that is that different people over different times will have a different sense as to what the dictates of conscience mean. Yeah. So there's always that tension within Christian history and within fundamentally Christian societies between the sense that people may have that there are absolute moral standards, and yet at the same time, certainly seen from the perspective of Jewish or particularly Muslim lawyers, scholars, whatever. The sense that Christian moral frameworks are actually quite slippery and quite prone to moving. And I think that that's pretty fundamental to the way in which Christianity has evolved over the 2,000 years, is that it is simultaneously something that has something very stable at its heart, a stable body of scriptures, stable body of rituals and so on. But at the same time, it's constantly evolving and indeed constantly splitting.
And so is Christianity and its propagation specifically to the West from the Middle East and origin, is that the reason why, as Puritanism that you is described in your book, is that why it's a uniquely Western thing? Is because it was carried through Christianity?
Well, Christianity, of course, isn't uniquely Western, as you say. I mean, it comes from
originally
Jesus and the initial disciples are Jews, and to begin with, it's very much a Mediterranean phenomenon. There are Christians who spread into Iraq, Iran. It's said in India that St. Thomas travelled to Kerala and planted a church there. So it's spreading eastwards as well. But its great base in antiquity is the Mediterranean world of the Roman Empire. And in fact, many of the greatest influences are actually African. So Tertullian, one of the first great writers about Christianity, is based in Carthage. Origen, I think the most sympathetic of all the church fathers, brilliant philosopher, is based in Alexandria. And then the distinctively powerful influence on the course of the Western church is St. Augustine, based at Hippo, quite obscure town in North Africa. And I don't think that if you'd asked people in the Roman world, say of the 4th century, where is the kind of the heartland of Christianity going to be over the next 1,000 years, they wouldn't have said, oh, it's going to be in France or Britain or still less Germany, because these are kind of barbarous backwaters compared to the great cosmopolitan cities of the Mediterranean world. It's just that the collapse of Roman power in the western half sets Latin-speaking Christendom, that half of the Roman Empire that both spoke Latin and has passed from Roman control, on a very distinctive course, as compared to the Christianity of the eastern half of the Roman Empire, ruled from Constantinople. And that's a kind of split that endures to this day, because on one side you have the Catholic Church, you have the Protestant churches. On the other, you have the Orthodox Church. And I guess in Dominion, I'm interested in what happens with the Latin Church, because in the long run, it's the Latin Church that gets exported around the world. And so it's the Latin Church that has by far the greatest impact globally. But that's not in any way to say that Christianity is to be equated with West European culture. It absolutely isn't. Right. It's just that the West European form is, in global terms, the most influential.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. And I'm just bringing it back to my previous question on absolutism. You asked me like what I mean by it. In my perspective, or rather definition thereof, I was more talking about the perspective. Actually, maybe it's related to the monarchy that you mentioned, in the term that something is absolute in the sense that there's no alternative. It's in the definition of the word absolute, as in this is the only path that should be followed. And in today's society, we have this context where a lot of socioeconomic problems, or rather socio-political problems, let me put it rather that way, a lot of socio-political problems kind of see the absolute as, or striving towards the absolute as a type of like solving the problem that they think exists. We have the scenario where living standards are increasing. So the reason living standards are increasing quite sustainably across the world, with I think the Gates note specifically mentioning a lot of key markers that show the living standards improving, and then problems are being eliminated. So without problems, we are unable to be heroes, and therefore we must contrive with some perhaps sometimes even irrational fears and dangers that we can go cast ourselves as heroes. This is something that you mentioned on the trigonometry podcast. Do you feel like this is fair, that the people are striving towards using these concepts to create themselves as create problems that they themselves can solve and can be heroes of in today's sense? Does that connect with the way that it's applied in history?
Well, I think that I think at the moment there are plenty of problems for people to wrestle with. We're just looking at what's happening in India as I sit here, with the terrible spike in COVID deaths there.
Yes.
These are problems that the world has been wrestling with for the past year or so, and it's clearly not going away imminently. So there are huge calls there for people to wrestle with problems, and I think more broadly that the world faces immense problems, and I think that they relate to climate change and environmental degradation and collapse in biodiversity, and I think that the jury is massively out on just how calamitous these problems may end up being. But I think there's certainly no lack of potential heroes out there, I hope. If there are, please get to work, because the planet needs you.
Exactly, yeah. But sorry. So I agree with that entirely. I think there's some serious issues that the world as a whole could focus on and can improve so much, and especially the cohesion among people. But I see people being divided specifically because I think that their solution to the serious problems that we have might be the best one. And so they kind of get polarized, because all of the topics you mentioned now, the coronavirus, the ecological issues, the climate change issues, a lot of these are topics that kind of divide people in that sense. So they kind of think like, my way is the right way, it's the highway. Is that something that we kind of see repeating in history? Or is there a way in which we can actually consolidate this? Because ideally, we'd like to work together. We'd like to find the middle ground.
Humans are inherently competitive. Okay. And I think that while on the one hand, the appeal to a kind of an order that is broader than one's limited horizons is very powerful. and I think in the West is absolutely derives from kind of Christian teachings, because the fundamental kind of perspective on the nature of divinity, on deity, that Christians right from the beginning cast is that God is the creator of every human being, man and woman, that they're all created equally in his image, and therefore they will have a shared and inherent dignity. And Paul in his letters says, there is no Greek or Jew, there is no man or woman, there is no slave or free. That in that sense, the Christian ethnos, the Christian people, are not to be identified as most people in the Roman Empire assumed, with particular cities or particular places or particular landscapes. That the Christian people are at home across the entire world, and that therefore they are properly to be considered universal. And that tension between the loyalty that most people feel towards the local and the aspiration to identify with the universal is indeed one that runs, I think, throughout Christian history. I think it's also there in Muslim history as well. I think that Christianity and Islam are the two great universalist ways of understanding the world. And they're related. They both grow out of a kind of common cultural milieu. But I think that I think it's tough for humans to do that. I think that I'm sure lots of people have felt this, that their prime loyalty in a pandemic, for instance, is to their nearest and dearest, to their parents, right, to their siblings, to their spouses, to their children, and then perhaps to your own communities around you, and then perhaps to your own country, and only then perhaps to the entire world. And we've certainly seen this. I'm sure you have in South Africa as well. That the kind of anxiety becomes, well, what are we going to do for our country? And then perhaps we can start looking at the broader world. And I think that's human nature, of course. I mean, that's inherent. The tension between people who consider themselves children of the world, of the entire world, and those who consider themselves, that their prime loyalty is to their nearest and dearest.
But it's a fascinating concept you discuss, or rather bring up here. And this is why I would recommend that anybody that's interested to please read your book called Dominion, to rather just search that up with Tom Holland, because it is so fascinating and brings up all of these extremely, it's I think you actually mentioned that, it's kind of weird for perhaps a historian to talk about something that's very relevant today, but it's extremely topical still in the way that you apply and the way that you study in the book. So I definitely recommend that. But I want to pivot over specifically to your podcast, The Rest History, or The Rest is History, where you discussed two hypotheticals. So you say, for example, what would have happened if the Roman Empire hadn't fallen? So it existed for an extremely long time, but in the end, it kind of deteriorated between the two hemispheres, like you called Latin Roman history, and of course the Eastern Roman Empire. And what if the Nazis had conquered Britain in that alternative history as well? And this is something that's, I think, a lot of people ask, like they're really curious, like the what if scenario. Could you perhaps just explain these two ideas and what you believe would have happened next in each case?
They're rather different, because I think that the conclusion that we came to is that the Roman Empire was pretty much bound to fall. Because and it's almost impossible to think of a circumstance in which it might not have, in which it wouldn't have done. That actually, what's remarkable about the Roman Empire is not that it ends up falling, but that it survives for as long as it does.
Right.
So in that sense, the hypothetical is fantastical, because it's almost impossible to imagine a circumstance in which it would survive. I mean, I guess if it had, then Europe would look perhaps a bit more like China, where there have been many empires, and yet a sense of continuity has prevailed between each dynasty. So a sense of kind of Chinese continuity has survived conquest by outsiders, imperial implosion, times of famine and disaster. Whereas in Europe that didn't happen. But I think the reason that it didn't happen in Europe is basically geography. China has these great plains, these great river valleys, whereas Europe is divided up by mountains and by seas. And so ever since the Roman Empire fell, conquerors have sought to resurrect a kind of a Roman Empire, and they've always failed. Charlemagne, Philip II of Spain, Napoleon, Hitler however broad the kind of temporary command that they've brought over Europe, it's never lasted. So I think that what pondering that hypothetical, what if the Roman Empire hadn't fallen, brings home is the kind of incredible influence of geography and topography on the way that history evolves. And actually, what's distinctive about the Roman Empire is how freakish it is. It's the only example of a kind of unitary continental empire in the western half of Eurasia, of the kind that you get in China throughout Chinese history. What if the Nazis had invaded Britain? I mean, that does seem to me a choke point in not just European but global history. Had the Nazis occupied Britain, then who knows where we'd be. I think history would be incalculably different on that. But again, I think that really there was only a very, very fleeting window of opportunity for the Nazis to win. And essentially that was in May 1940, when the British Army was trapped in northern France, and there was a possibility that Lord Halifax, rather than Winston Churchill, becomes Prime Minister.
Right.
And he does become Prime Minister, and then there is agitation from Lord Halifax, who's become Foreign Secretary, to open negotiations with Hitler while the British Army is trapped in northern France. And had that happened, then I think Hitler might have won. But I think once Churchill has decided to fight on, actually, British power is such that it would have been almost impossible for the Germans to beat Britain from that point on. And that, I think, is why Churchill decides to fight on, because he knows that it's very unlikely that the Germans would be able to invade Britain.
But from my perspective, and I have to say this as a perspective of somebody that doesn't live in Britain, so I wouldn't necessarily understand the context. But from my perspective as an outsider, and especially in the way in which it's portrayed in popular history, that I am not under the impression that Britain would have accepted peace with Germany. Or was it specifically Winston Churchill's insistence that they will fight on, no matter the costs, to solve this, that actually pushed the British people to do it? In other words, I was under the impression that the British people would have not allowed this to happen, doesn't matter what Lord Halifax intended or not. Or is this a misconception? Was Winston the driving force?
I think that I think that had Britain been led by someone who was a defeatist, who thought that there was no point in carrying on because we were going to suffer terribly if we fought on, and that therefore the best option for the British people would be to negotiate a peace, then I think the British people would have gone along with that. I mean, lots of people would not, of course. I mean, nobody would have liked it. No. But if they were told that's the best thing to do, and the evidence, that's what happens in France. But I think that Churchill gives voice to the determination of lots of people in Britain to fight on, and he's able to do that not just because he's kind of engaged in mad vainglory, but because Britain is a kind of massive global power still in the 1940s. It has the largest navy in the world. It has vast empire at its back. It has huge quantities of manpower. It can close off the seas. It can adopt the strategy that it adopted against the Kaiser, against Napoleon, against the French in the 7 Years' War, essentially just to throttle the shipping lanes. And that's exactly what happens. And Churchill's punt proves correct.
So perhaps, related to this or further back in history, who would you say is your favorite historical figure and why, perhaps?
Oh, goodness, that's a question. Who is my favorite historical figure? That is a very difficult question because it entirely depends on my mood and but I would say that my favorite historical figure actually is the first historian. So the person who makes history possible. The Greek writer Herodotus, who writes in the 5th century about the wars between the Greeks and the Persians. So the campaigns of Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, Plataea. But the reason that I love Herodotus is that, in a sense, he's the patron saint of historians, because he's interested, of course, in the wars that he's describing, but he's also interested in absolutely everything else. So you start this is the first work of history ever written. And he begins it by saying, you know, I'm writing this because I want to explain how it was that the Greeks and the Persians went to war, and what it was that made them do it, and then I'm going to tell you the story. And you think, great, okay, bring it on. But it takes him about 400 pages to get there, because he's constantly being sidetracked by everything else he finds interesting. So, suddenly you're reading about some king who wants his bodyguard to see his wife naked. And then you're reading about a guy who's jumped off a ship and landed on the back of a dolphin. And then you're reading about all the strange stuff that the Egyptians get up to, and their relationship to cats and crocodiles, and how they built pyramids and how they mummify bodies. And then you're reading about Indians and the giant ants that dig up gold. And you're reading about the Scythians and how they get high on marijuana and have saunas. And it's everything about it is fascinating and wonderful. And I think that for his display of limitless curiosity, I would nominate Herodotus.
No. I mean, I have some friends who studied history and ancient cultures, and she once told me, like, it's the pain of her who's so in love with ancient cultures and history that she wants to know so much, but in the end of the day, you kind of have to specialize in a certain point because history is just too big to check, to discover everything there is around it. So I definitely can see that same spirit there.
But also the trauma of studying ancient history is there's so much you want to know that you can't know.
Right.
You don't know. And the gaps are enormous. And even where you might have evidence, there's so much that you don't know. So ancient Egypt, I mean, famous, the monuments are perhaps the most stupefying in the whole of the ancient world. But because we don't have kind of gossipy biographies of the kind that the Romans wrote about their emperors, or the kind of relentless interest in writing stuff down that Herodotus shows, you look at, the great sculptures of Ramesses II or Akhenaten, and there's so much you don't know. It's kind of like gazing at, the hardware and not having the software. So that's a constant source of frustration. And so that's the joy of Herodotus, is that you have kind of 600 pages of him just going on about everything that's interesting at the time that he's living.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, that part's amazing. So, we also have all these terms for the rest of us who don't necessarily study history. It's like, hindsight is 2020, and you have to learn from history, otherwise it repeats itself. Of all these terms, but as an historian yourself, what would you say is the greatest advantage of studying history? Is it to not repeat it? Is it to learn, just know, what it really contained, the whole story? What's the detail?
I think the great advantage of studying history is that it makes your life more interesting. It's interesting. It's interesting, and like everything that's interesting, it will therefore inform your present. It's not like there are ready packaged lessons that will be served up. I mean, perhaps "Don't Invade Asia" would be one.
Yeah,
I think that rarely works. Really comes well. Definitely "Don't Invade Russia in Winter" would be another. No. But by and large, the fascination of history is, there are no definite answers, because the lessons that you draw on history will depend on where you stand geographically, where you stand in terms of history, your perspectives, your views. And often, our understanding of the past will change in light of the present. So we may have one particular perspective at a certain time in a certain place that will then be radically reconfigured and changed. And that is what makes it so interesting, because it's kind of like real life science fiction. The past is like the present, but it's also nothing like the present. And it's that mixture of the familiar and the utterly strange that, to me, makes it so compelling.
No, I can definitely imagine. So yeah, thank you so much. That perspective was really, really fun to see. I just want to turn to a slightly more somber note and talk about some of the other projects you've done. Specifically, you received quite a bit of blowback for a documentary you did called Islam, the Untold Story. Could you just perhaps give us a rundown of the argument that you made in that specific documentary?
Yeah, it was a documentary made on the back of a book I wrote called In the Shadow of the Sword, which looked at the way in which in late antiquity, so that's kind of towards the end of the Roman Empire, the great powers in the Mediterranean and the Near East used various understandings of God to uphold their sense of global power. So Constantine the Great converts to Christianity, and the Roman Empire becomes Christian. And so you have a single God ruling the world. And so for the Roman emperors, this means that the Roman Empire can serve as a mirror to this divine order.
Mm.
And essentially, if you have a universal God who's created everything, then you should have a universal empire with a universal emperor. And so it's very useful for them. And likewise, in Persia, where you have the Sasanian dynasty. They're Zoroastrian. They have the conviction that the world is divided into rival spheres of good and evil, darkness and light, the lie and truth. And again, that's incredibly useful for the Sasanian emperors because they can cast themselves as agents of light, and they can cast
Right.
they can cast their enemies as agents of darkness. And then you have the Jews, likewise, who are I've talked about the Talmud already. This is the period when they're constructing the Talmud. And then, of course, a lot of the Roman Empire in the 7th century gets swallowed up by the Arabs, and the whole of the Sasanian Empire does. And what had been a Roman Persian world, a Christian Zoroastrian world, becomes an Arab and, in the long run, Muslim world. And the great caliphates that emerge in the 7th, 8th, through into the 9th century are empires very much that, in a sense, clearly derive from the prototype of empires that the Romans and the Sasanians had established. So I was interested in Islam as an expression of one of those kind of imperial projects, and asking, where did it come from? And I'm not a Muslim, so I don't think that Muhammad received revelations from God. I don't think the Quran comes from God. I think the Quran, is a product of the distinctive cultures of the late antique Middle East. And essentially, that then means that the stories told by Muslims about who Muhammad was and how the Quran came into being, from my point of view, cannot be true, because they depend on believing that God gave these as revelations. So if I don't believe that, then what explanation can I provide for where they came from? And the essential context for that is that the sources for the life of Muhammad and commentaries on the Quran and so on are by and large about 200 years after the lifetime of Muhammad. So in a time where essentially oral tradition serves as a kind of Chinese whispers, that means that there's a lot that is not to be relied upon as evidence for what happened in the 7th century, as opposed to, say, the early 9th century when they were written. In other words, that they're back projections, and that therefore essentially we can't. I think that it's very difficult to know what actually happened with what we now call the beginnings of Islam. But essentially, the argument of both the book and the film was that the Arab Empire came first, and then Islam emerged from it, rather than, as is traditionally thought, Islam emerges in the depths of Arabia, and this then inspires the Arabs to go and conquer an empire in the name of Islam. So you can see why, for Muslims, this would be a kind of unwelcome argument, I guess.
Of course, yeah. And slightly more in the modern context, there was also another one called ISIS, The Origins of Violence. We go on to state that there is a connection between Islam's and the horrors that ISIS inflicted, where ISIS, of course, translates or rather stands for Islamic State in Syria. Can you elaborate on that? Or why do you think it was such a controversial statement saying that Islam and ISIS is connected, and if they're even connected in name?
Well, essentially, what the Islamic State fighters were trying to do was to, as the name implies, their leader proclaimed himself a caliph. They wanted to resurrect what they saw as being the kind of primal model of a caliphate, and they looked to Islamic prophecy and scripture and law codes to try and provide them with a framework for what they should do. And they applied this in a very kind of literalist and bloody way. So on the film, we focused on the sufferings of Christians in northern Iraq and the rules on how Christians should be treated, mandated in the Quran and in the Sunnah, is that they should be obliged to pay taxes, they should acknowledge their own subordination, and then in return they should be allowed to have freedom to practice their faith. ISIS applied this rule but didn't actually allow them to practice their faith. So essentially, it became a kind of license for extortion. But the people who really suffered were a religious minority called the Yazidis, who, in the Quran, it said that that only the people of the book should be given this license. That if they are called what are called mushrikin, which is kind of conventionally translated as pagans, then they should be essentially, the men should be slaughtered and the women should be enslaved. And ISIS said, well, the Yazidis are mushrikin, and therefore we should target them for destruction because that's what God wants. And they applied these laws very, very literally. And it seems to me that it's ridiculous to deny that that's why they were doing it. That was the source for what they were doing. I mean, I think essentially it was a kind of license for them to take sex slaves. They killed Yazidi men and enslaved women and girls, often as young as 8. But the license that they claimed for this was that they were following the example of Muhammad, and that's. The Yazidis are not going to be safe unless that is faced up to.
Right.
And essentially that practice gets established to the satisfaction of Muslim scholars as being unacceptable.
Yeah, and I mean, you speak about the atrocities that has happened and the context of which it happened because you saw it firsthand. You visited these countries, right? And you saw some of these on some of your ventures. Is that something you could elaborate on, or was that just the basis of your research?
We went to a place called Sinjar when we were making the film. So this was in 2016, so 2 years after ISIS had moved into Sinjar. And we went there a few weeks after the Kurdish militia had recaptured it. But ISIS was still, a couple of miles away across no man's land from Sinjar, so within mortar range. And, it was a scene of devastation. It had been flattened. There was no way the Yazidis could go back. And if they did, they would be targeted again by the same people who targeted them previously. So and even to this day, with the Islamic State essentially, imploded, lots of them are still stuck in refugee camps because they can't. It's not safe for them to go home.
Right. Yeah, the homes were inherently destroyed.
Yeah, and it's terrible. And I remember going to a refugee camp, and there was a man there that I spoke to who'd been away from Sinjar when the Islamic State arrived, and his wife, his 2 daughters, his 2 sons had been abducted. And as he was talking, there was this kind of moaning coming from behind a curtain in the tent, and I could hear this kind of banging, and it was his wife who had been enslaved, kind of raped on a daily basis, and then her owner had shot her through the head, not killed her, but left her mentally impaired. And through a process of middlemen, the husband had brought her back, but she was lying there behind the curtain, kind of banging her head against the concrete floor on which the tent had been erected. So he had that was the soundtrack to his telling me what had happened to his daughters, aged 8 and 10. Had again, like their mother, been sold, were presumably being daily raped. His sons had been taken away, recruited into a militia, brainwashed, so that if they saw him, they would kill him. I mean, this is he's just one of multitudes and multitudes of Yazidis who've suffered like that. And I think that they deserve to be, the focus of global attention much more than they are. And I spoke to this man, and he said, your story is terrible. We'll do all we can to try and keep your profile kind of high in people's minds back in England. And he said, but nobody will care because you've got Christians in England, and they'll worry about the Christians in Iraq, and you've got Muslims in England, and they'll worry about the Muslims in Iraq. But there are no Yazidis, so nobody will care about us.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but I'll be honest. It's difficult to say, but I can understand where he's coming from. Like in terms of the point that he's making, it would be difficult to get somebody to care about this. But morally, on a human stand, hearing about this, one can also kind of imagine people being incredibly angry about this and want to take action. But I won't even pretend to understand or to say what I think is a possible solution. But what do you think is the correct response?
The solution is the awful thing.
Oh, okay. So you don't think there's a
I,
correct response to this, to the problem of ISIS and terrorism?
for the Yazidis, I don't think there is, because I think that ISIS is like a kind, it's like a kind of a, a dry rot
Hmm.
that you can try and treat, but it will always come back.
Hmm.
And I think I think it's too dangerous. I mean, how it would be like Jews liberated from Auschwitz having to go back and live among unrepentant Nazis.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's impossible.
It's an impossible situation for them.
Hmm.
But
Okay. Yeah. No, that
there
makes sense.
are there, but there are things that are obviously better than they were. ISIS is gone. Both the Kurdish and the Iraqi governments are I mean, they could be better, but they could be worse.
Hmm. Yeah.
And there are all kinds of charities and aid agencies that are working with them.
Hmm.
I mean, in fact, just 3 days ago, I did a 45-mile walk across London to try and raise money for them.
Hmm.
Um, so that there are things that can be done,
Hmm.
but their situation is a bleak one, and I think
Yeah.
a bit like the Uyghurs in China.
Hmm.
Um, the we certainly in Europe live in the shadow of the Holocaust,
Yeah.
and the mantra is never again, that we would never allow this.
Yeah.
But we are,
Yeah.
and the Rohingya in Myanmar.
Hmm.
There are groups of people who are suffering terribly,
Yeah.
but we're not
The,
really
the
interested.
the problem is that they're not at home. Like that's the context, and that's exactly what that man meant. Is it's like the mantra is never again, but the problem is the kind of attitude to that could be never again here, or rather never again in the way that it connects to that. So that's perhaps the connection why it's so important to keep it ever present in people's mind, so that support groups could look after these people in a way that could make their life more comfortable. It couldn't solve the problem, but at least it could make it more comfortable. Is that even a worthwhile sentiment?
I hope so. Yes. I mean,
Okay.
I think there's lots that could be done. Well, for instance, the children who were abducted, who are being redeemed, being brought back. I mean, the scale of their suffering is unimaginable,
Mm,
and they need help. They're just being returned, broken, shattered,
mm,
to not going home, but
mm,
going to basically to refugee camps. Their
mm,
suffering is off the pale.
mm,
And I think
mm,
that anyone with children of their own would contemplate their suffering and think, well, they deserve our help.
mm. Yeah, well, we'll hear from you what type of portals or accessibility options there are for people like us who could contribute that, and we'll add that to the description specifically for this case. But I do want to change the discussion again just to one of the last topics I want to talk about, where in 2016 you wrote an article called "Why I Was Wrong About Christianity" for the New Statesman, which is a very interesting discussion, talking about the influence that Christianity had in the development of many societies, but also among them the one we talked about in the Western society. Previously, you thought that Western values were derived from Greece and Rome, and you kind of didn't really own anything to Christianity. The context within the values that Greece and Rome perpetuated were Christianized, and therefore that's where the values came from. But you've since had a change of heart. Could you explain why you think it became core from Christianity rather than principles that already existed in Greece and Rome before Christianity?
Well, so I was writing books about Greece and particularly Rome,
Mm,
and actually it was on the most basic level that because I was writing in English,
mm,
uh, a European language, um, I found so many of the words that I wanted to use inadequate to sum up um, the world that I was describing. So words like religion,
mm,
secular, homosexuality, science. I mean, all kinds of words were carried a kind of a freight that risked becoming anachronistic.
mm.
And I kept thinking, well, why? What has changed? And the more I thought about it, the more I came to realize that essentially um, the impact of Christianity was so manifest that to speak English was, in a sense, to Christianize yourself.
Okay.
That that the weight of signification that English words have are so shaped by Christianity that it can be almost impossible to apply them to pre-Christian civilizations. And the more I thought about that, the more I came to see that when I look back at Greece or Rome, it was like trying to peer through a kind of dust haze. And that dust haze was made up of kind of tiny little Christian particles. I could kind of dimly make out the lineaments, but it was a real effort to try and to get rid of them. And I wanted, so the article, what had I got wrong, was basically I hadn't realized how Christian I was.
Okay.
I had not realized how Christian I was in my assumptions, in my attitudes, in my morals, in the most basic way that I understood and saw the world. So I'll give you an example, which is a word that might seem impeccably Greek and have nothing to do with Christianity, which is democracy. So people say, it's people power.
Yeah.
That's how it's translated. And so people
history
look
in
back,
Athens. It's very Greek.
So it comes, associated with Athens in the late 6th, 5th, 4th centuries BC in Greece. And we assume that there's a continuity between the democracy practiced by the Athenians and the democracy that we have in the modern world. And so we look back at ancient Greece and we say, but what about the slaves? What about the foreigners? What about the women? They didn't have a vote, so therefore it couldn't really be a democracy. And in doing that, we are assuming that the Athenian democracy was founded on certain principles, namely that everyone has a kind of right to, they have rights, that's what underpins democracy, your democratic right to a vote. And that's the logic that in 20th century meant that women were given the right to vote. It's what underpinned, obviously in South Africa, the extension of the franchise to everyone in South Africa. There is no slave or free. There is no Greek or Jew. There is no man or woman. There is no black or white. Everyone is equal. This is a Christian perspective. It's founded on the idea that all human beings have a fundamental dignity. But that's not what democracy in Athens was about. It's not the founding principle. Actually, it's better to think of it as the power of the demos. And what is the demos? The demos to the Athenians is the sum of people who are sprung from the soil of Attica in the present, in the past, and in the future. And they have a sacral bond to the earth that has given them birth and to the gods that look after them. And everybody who belongs to that demos has a role to play. And the role of men is to fight and to legislate. So that's why they have their votes. That's why they sit in the assembly. That's why women don't go. But women also have their role, which is to mediate above with the gods and above all with the goddess Athena, who gives her name to the city of Athens. And for the Athenians, that's just as important as sitting in the assembly, perhaps even more important. And so the premise that we bring as people shaped by Christianity is one that struggles massively, massively to come to terms with that, because we don't think to look at it in those terms. And so we sit in judgment on the Athenians for denying women or slaves the vote. But to the Athenians, it would have seemed perfectly obvious why they were doing that. But you have to think yourself back into a pre-Christian frame of mind properly to get that. And it's that degree of effort, because I think, to be honest, one of the things that being kind of globally hegemonic, as Europeans have been, and perhaps particularly if you're an English speaker from Britain or from America, you've had 2 centuries of being able to assume that your values and your ideals and the way that you see the world is just the natural order of things. That's just the way things are. I think that as Western power retreats, that becomes less and less the case. I think that more and more we in the West will come to understand that our way of seeing the world is just one way of many different ways. and that actually, our values, our assumptions, our ideals are very, very contingent, culturally contingent. But I think that for the past 2 centuries, that's been, we've been able to coast by, assuming that the way that we see the world is just the way things are. And I don't think that's the case. And I think that in our essence, the way that we see the world is shaped above all by Christianity. And that doesn't mean that you have to believe in God, doesn't mean you have to go to church, doesn't mean that you even have to really know anything at all about Christianity. But it does mean that it's kind of like, those particles of dust that I talked about, that you just breathe them in, and you may not even realize that you're breathing them in, but there they are. It's part of the oxygen that you're breathing in.
Is it then fundamentally in the same way that Christianity seems to be quite shrinking in terms of Western society as a popular, methodology, way of thinking, religious perspective? Is that the same way connected to a way that the Western way of thinking is this is just the way that the world works is also shrinking, and perhaps even more of a different world's perspective, whether that be African or Eastern hemisphere? Is that also the reason why they might be gaining?
No, I think Christianity isn't shrinking globally.
Okay.
I mean, in Africa, it's spread like wildfire.
Right.
Since the 50s. I mean, its growth has been of an astonishing rate, and it's spreading like wildfire in parts of Asia. And I use wildfire because the fastest growing denomination of Christianity of all is Pentecostalism. And Pentecostal, it's the fire of Pentecost, the fire of the Spirit coming down. It's that idea of kind of living fire spreading around the world. Very, very important and transformative. It's along with radical Islam. Pentecostalism is the great transformative 21st century kind of cultural movement. But I think in the West, in the West, definitely there's the feeling that it's shrinking because more and more people kind of define themselves as being not just post-Christian but anti-Christian. But I think that the kind of strident atheism that we see often in the West is just another form of kind of Christianity. It's a logical endpoint for the campaign that Christianity has always embodied against what it casts as superstition, against idolatry, against the belief that there's the divine in shrubs or springs or mountaintops or whatever. That ultimately goes back to the Hebrew prophets. That conviction that you should get rid of superstition ultimately has turned on Christianity itself, but it's bred of Christian assumptions, I think. And so that means that essentially the West remains absolutely shot through with a Christian way of seeing the world, because the things that it doesn't believe in are very Christian things.
Yeah. No, exactly.
So therefore, you can be shaped by what you lack. That can define you. And I think that what we lack and what we reject is Christian, and so therefore we remain defined by it.
No, exactly. Okay, yeah. That's a very interesting perspective. I never actually thought about the one actually causing the other one and the way in which it's connected. So thank you so much for sharing that for us. I just want to give you a last opportunity if there's anything you wanted to share, anything you wanted to plug.
Well, I mentioned the walk that I did for Yazidis, and I play for a cricket team here in England, and in county cricket here, a player after 10 years gets a benefit, and they all over the course of the season they raise money, and then they can keep the money to kind of tide them over into retirement. I've played for this team for 10 years, so I've been given a benefit, but my benefit is we're raising money for the Yazidis and for various homeless charities, and if anyone wanted to contribute to that, I would be absolutely delighted. I think it's such a kind of wonderful cause. So that's what I'd like to plug, since you've given me the opportunity. So thank you for that.
No, of course. And thank you so much. We're definitely going to add that in the description and encourage people to go and look at that as well. But just for your side, I just want to thank you so much. This has been so interesting. It's always kind of funny. It's only after the point that history has repeated itself that people seem to want to go listen to historians. So I want to bring out the perspective that we should rather listen to you before it repeats itself. So in that regard, thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us. And just to our viewers, I just want to say, if you've made it thus far in the video, you most definitely have liked the video. So please, by all all means, like and share this video to share Tom's perspective on the world and his historical expertise. You're more than welcome to check out some of the books that we'll have in the description as well. So thank you so much for watching. This has been WorldView.